welcome everyone to the 20th Geoffrey Bawa Memorial Lecture. It's 20 years since Geoffrey Bawa passed away on the 27th of May, and the very year, on the 23rd of July, we had the very first memorial lecture delivered by Professor Senaka Bandaranaike, who analyzed Geoffrey Bawa's contribution to culture in Sri Lanka. It's a classic piece of writing on his part, academic writing on his part today. And 20 years later and 20 speakers later, as diverse as Sumaya Wali from South Africa, Kengo Kuma, Abdel Wahed El Wakil, Yang Zhao, Juan Pablo Serrano and Francisco Serrano from Mexico, Kate Otten from South Africa, Bijoy Jain, Wang Munsom and Richard Hassel from Australia, Cecil Balmont, Kerry Hill, and all these eminent architects who came and presented their work with us and to us, to a Sri Lankan audience over the many years. So we have been very lucky to have this incredible list of speakers, and also very grateful for the support of Miles Young, who brought most of these people out here. His support for the trust has been incredible. And for almost 18 years, he would simply say, you can bring anyone from anywhere in the world, and he would pay for it. And that's an extraordinary commitment that Miles had for all of those years. So thank you, Miles. I know he's not here, but thank you, Miles, for all of those years of support and encouragement to the trust. This year we are taking a slightly more retrospective turn. All this while it was architects presenting their work. Here we're looking back a little bit, and the lecture is part of our On Gardens series, an opportunity to work with two other institutions across 3 continents who work with the legacies of makers. Here we have, in the Geoffrey Bawa Trust, an incredible legacy that the architect left, not just in this extraordinary garden that we are all sitting in, and the lecture for the first time being held here, but also in a legacy of drawings, letters, and architecture across the country and outside in the south of India as well, a legacy that we are all very proud of, and the country is very proud of as well. He did build the national legislature after all. And so it's an extraordinary legacy that we look at. The other two, of course, are also makers of gardens. The Institute of Burle Marx in Rio de Janeiro looks after the wonderful work of Burle Marx mostly in Brazil, and the Noguchi Museum in New York. Not that we are looking for parallels about how they might have worked or similarities, but we think the sustenance of some of these gardens and some of these legacies are something that we need to talk about, particularly in this very significant year of the 75th anniversary of this garden. Lots of gardens last for a long time, but how do you keep them going has always been a question for a lot of people. So today we have with us 2 people, one, our own Chief Curator, Shayari de Silva, and of course, most importantly, Isabela Ono, who is the founder and executive director of the Burle Marx Institute. She's a landscape architect with a master's degree in urbanism. Isabela has more than 25 years of professional experience in the landscape design area, working directly with Haryushe Ono, her father, Robert E. Burle Marx's creative partner for almost 30 years. Since the beginning of her career, she worked in the development of a multitude of landscape projects, and in parallel worked in the archive, supporting academic researchers and co-curators' content for exhibitions and publications of Burle Marx's legacy, becoming an expert on the subject. She has recently curated 2 exhibitions in Brazil, 2001 and 2023. Isabela inherited her father's passion for the landscape profession and belief in the relevance of preserving the Burle Marx Landscape Collective collection through making them accessible globally, opening possibilities to think of new meanings from his legacy. Isabela believes in the collection and their concepts and narratives to spread the philosophy on the well-being of individuals by incorporating nature and artistry, to create the possibility of the utopian urban environment, and inspiring new, greener, and healthier visions for the cities of the future. Our own Shayari has overseen the programs around the exhibition, publication, and conservation of the Bawa Trust since 2018, where she is the chief curator. Recent exhibitions in the trust include The Gift, a 5-site specific installation at Lunuganga by Kengo Kuma, Lee Ming Wei, Dominic Sanzoni, Dayanita Singh, and Chandragupta Tenura. And It is Essential to Be There, the first exhibition to draw from the Geoffrey Bawa archives, on view in Colombo and New Delhi. Shayari co-edited Perspecta 51, Medium, the Yale Architecture Journal published by the MIT Press in 2018, and edited Geoffrey Bawa, Drawing from the Archives, published by Lars Muller Publications in 2023. She has worked previously for the Yale Art Gallery and Yale Center for British Art, where she was a Bartels Scholar in Building Conservation. Shayari obtained a bachelor's degree from Yale University in Architectural History and Theory and Criticism, and a professional master's degree from the Yale University's School of Architecture. So without taking too much of your time, which I've already taken quite a bit of, I'd like to call Isabela, call Shayari to deliver her comments about preserving the legacies of Bawa and the connections she's trying to make with other such institutions. Shayari.
Thank you, Channa. And thank you to all of you who are here. I cannot tell you how wonderful it is to see so many of you, familiar and unfamiliar faces. We have been working on this project of thinking about how we celebrate and use the occasion of this garden's 75th anniversary to think about what the garden means in Bawa's practice, its collaborative practice, to think about ourselves as an institution, what it means for how we approach our collections, our archives, our community. And 75 years seems about the right time to really take a step back, but also very much looking forward. And we've also been thinking a lot about the different ways in which Bawa used the garden. Many of you know he was ill, very ill for the last 5 years of his life. Where he was non-vocal, he was not able to walk through the garden anymore. And we've been thinking about the different ways that a garden, much more than even a building, allows access beyond language, a kind of empathy that we feel when we connect with nature. And it has been really incredible to have the Instituto Burle Marx and the Noguchi Museum as collaborators in thinking through some of these questions. This whole weekend for us is a launch of a program. The program is a process, and a process I hope we can go on together. And we did start with a workshop in May, but this On Gardens project is actually beginning today with Isabela's talk. And I'm going to offer you just a few thoughts about some of the things we hope to explore in this project. So it is curious, and Angelendran has noted this beautifully in Clara's film, that Bawa, who we know as an architect, first worked for the longest time on a garden. Many of you know that he found this garden as an abandoned cinnamon and rubber plantation in January 1948, 1 month before Sri Lanka gained independence. And if you think about what a plantation estate is and what an extractive kind of engagement with the land that is, it is almost decolonial of him to turn it back into a garden, and not just a garden, it is a garden that really celebrates Sri Lankans' connection, I think everyone's connection, but especially our endemic species and our connection as people, as a community with these species. The way what we eat, our medicines, our shelter is so grounded in the trees that we live with. And we are over 80% rural in Sri Lanka, and that engagement is very, very close. We can also see this garden, and I feel quite amazing that we have Sumangala who drew this drawing in our audience. But it forms a kind of spine to his architectural corpus. We can see it We can maybe read it as a biography. We know that Bawa was kind of suspicious of archives. I think he was wary of us approaching his architecture through drawing because he thought so much about the experience of inhabiting them. And perhaps you've heard the story that when he moved offices from Alfred House Gardens to 33rd Lane, he created a bonfire and burnt a few of those drawings. But what we also know that is when he set the Trust Deed in 1982, 40 years ago, he thinks about the use of this garden, the use which was for him a very private experience, what it could be after that. And I think seeing you all here today, we can see what a visionary person he was, that he understood that this was a place we would enjoy and celebrate and study for generations to come. So perhaps we can also consider Lunuganga as a vital living part of our archive, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. But we do know how carefully he planned and planted this garden. And if we think of the kind of definition of archives, that they are repositories of reliable, authentic, and usable sources, I would argue that this garden is very much one of those. We know that it is a testing ground. Just behind you, you see the hen house, that many have speculated was a maquette for the kinds of wall and roof structures that he would use in the pavilions for the Sri Lankan Parliament that he would complete in 1982, and you see it here. We also know that in 1983, right after the Parliament was completed, a time when he was working on the Ruhunu, very big, expansive projects, so he was also working on the Ruhunu University, he builds the Sandala, which is one of the most remarkable spaces. If you think about what happened in Sri Lanka in 1983, it was a year of horrific violence. And to make a place that is so meditative, that is actually a place to work, because I've also heard that it was a place in which he had enough space to work on the giant drawings that projects like Ruhunu required. We can also think of the way the garden is informed by things that happen in his practice. As you've been walking around today, you've probably observed how carefully calibrated the textures, proportions, and dimensions of everything you experience is to your being there. The sundial, which is in the butterfly pond right there, is maybe a perfect example of that. It works because of its precise location with something that is very vast. But I also think that there is something very expansive about Bawa's spaces. We often feel like we are in something much, much larger than ourselves. If you take, for example, the view across Cinnamon Hill, where now we have Rina's incredible Fluid Geographies piece, your eye runs the length of the space all the way to the far horizon, the Qingja arresting and slowing your gaze. There is a sense that we perceive space in relation to things. And this is described beautifully by Ulipo writer George Perec in his book, Species of Spaces and Other Pieces. He says, our gaze travels through space and gives us the illusion of relief and distance. This is how we construct space, with an up and down, a left and right, an in front and a behind, a near and a far. Something else that we know about Bawa was how reticent he was to use categories. And I think in the work of Bawa, Burle Marx, and Noguchi, we see worlds that are hybrid, that are multi-layered and multifaceted. If you take, for example, the name for the garden, Lunuganga, a lexical blend, Lunu means salt, Ganga means river, alluding to the brackish water that surrounds the peninsula. Salt and water dissolved and amalgamated. This is a place where things intertwine, art and architecture, buildings and garden. So here you have Bawa, who we think of as an architect, Burle Marx, a landscape designer, Noguchi, who is a sculptor. But another link, I think, is the way that they are so genre-defying, and each of them really stretch the disciplines from which they work to work across disciplines, across mediums, defying any kind of narrow definition, if we were to use Bawa's words. They also each had mixed ancestry, and they embodied East-West, North-South identities, which no doubt contributed to the worlds that they championed, inclusive and expansive. Bawa is of mixed Muslim, English, and Dutch Burgher lineage. Burle Marx has a German emigrant father and a Brazilian mother, and Noguchi has an American mother and a Japanese father. I would like to return to this idea of geography in a bit, but they're also born within 15 years of each other, Noguchi in 1904, Burle Marx 5 years later, and Bawa 10 years after that, in 1919. In their lifetime, the way we understood and approached architecture was shaken by the movement that we call the modern movement. It's not to say that every age doesn't have a cultural movement that underscores and then eventually overwrites that movement, that time. But in the early years of modernism, it sought a tabula rasa approach, rupturing from the past and seeking order and seeking universals. And this is why gardens are not really a part of that early modern movement. But as makers of because gardens also require specificity, they require locality, and you build on something. There is a terrain. But as makers of gardens, Burle Marx, Noguchi, and Bawa each play a vital role in inflecting rootedness, a connection with the past, and a connection with locale, that then those movements, those cultural movements absorb as they evolve. So they each actually inflect a lot into the way we understand our world. And I think a lot of this has to do with the elemental connections to nature that different cultures have. In The Transformation of Nature in Art, Ananda Kumaraswamy writes, "Let us not forget that the mind is a part and the most important part of our knowledge of nature, and that this point of view, though it may have been forgotten in Europe, has been continuously current in Asia for more than 2,000 years. Where European art naturally depicts a moment of time, an arrested action, or an effect of light, Oriental art represents a continuous condition. To work with gardens is to work with time." And I think when Kumaraswamy uses this word Oriental, he's also using a word that made sense in the time that he was working. But I would really argue that these are perspectives, and perspective is something that comes from your own position. We might recall the Bellman's map in Lewis Carroll's The Hunting of the Snark, which you see there on the left, where he says, "What's the good of Mercator's North Poles and Equators, tropics, zones, and meridian lines?" So the bellman would cry, and the crew would reply, "They are merely conventional signs." And this is the map that Bawa used to start both of the books that he worked on, the Lunuganga book and the White Book by Brian Brace Taylor, which is a map of the world centered on Colombo. He was very aware that where we see as the center is determined by where we're looking from. The title of this talk and of this project comes from a quote by Noguchi, who says of gardens, "For me, a garden is a highly sculptural affair. The real purpose of the garden may be this contemplation of the relative in time, space, and life." And for those of you who have been thinking, well, I thought Noguchi was a sculptor, he actually did make many gardens, including the museum in Queens, in Mura in Japan, but he also described his sculptures, particularly the ones that were composed of multiple parts, as gardens. I think gardens generally, and Noguchi's work particularly, rely on relational qualities. They're understood vis-a-vis things, other things. And the space you see here is the Beinecke Plaza at Yale. You do not enter this space, you view it from the ground level above or from the basement below through the glass. And where you engage with it is in your mind. And that is where it makes sense. It plays on this idea that a garden is a combination of the man-made and the natural, and you have the stone, and over the cycles of the year, the stone, the sunshine, the snow transform this space. And here you see Noguchi's own photograph of Ryonji in Kyoto, which is another famous garden that you don't enter. We see here his own photos from his extensive travels in South Asia, Jantar Mantar in Delhi, and a village in Manipur. And in these photographs, you see he's very interested in observing and documenting spiritual buildings, rituals, landscapes, and domestic objects, but often as they relate to other things, in arrangement. And then in 1949, when this garden was 1 year old, he visits Sri Lanka. And on the left, you see his photograph of Sigiriya. And on the right, you see a sculpture that he makes 21 years later. It's quite unusual for him to give a piece such a literal name. So this work is called Sigiriya. He would often use very conceptual ideas like void or becoming. But I guess if you don't speak Sinhalese and you don't realize that Sigiriya is a portmanteau of Singha, which is lion, and Giriya, which is rock, it is a very lyrical sound. And as the same way that the sound makes sense in your brain, I think the work embodies this combination of something that is found, that is natural, and the man-made, which is exactly what Sigiriya is. And the amazing thing about Sigiriya is that is true of the rock fortress, but also the water gardens that surround it, which echo this intertwining of found topological contour and an inserted geometric order. Bawa was also very keenly attuned to these ancient landscapes and gardens. Historian Shanti Jayawardena, an author of Geoffrey Manning Bawa, Decolonizing Ceylon, notes that there's a lineage that you can chart in his design for the parliament. She writes of Lunuganga, it may be that the magic of Lunuganga comes from its myriad twisting steps, terraces, wild planting, dramatic cliffs, and shifting chiaroscuro that are in sympathy with the secret, unpredictable rhythms of the wilderness traditions of the forest and the Giri monasteries that embody the aesthetics of restraint. Others have speculated on Kandalama Hotel, which is again a real combination of a found boulder and a man-made structure. And shifting a little bit, and we've been talking a lot this weekend about shifts in scale, what we see from above, the microscopic and the cosmic. And I think this is something that, again, Burle Marx was very attuned to. He observes that every discovery of our modern age can be turned to advantage by artists. Microphotography has made man familiar with the amoebic shapes, which provide a contrast with the angular shapes of a building. Aerial photography shows the relation that exists between the contours of the earth and these amoebic shapes inspires us to analogical repetition on a different scale, which is a valuable element in a garden. I'm bringing this quote because I think something that all three of them were very attuned to was this sense of the individual, the micro, and then the macro, and the networks and communities. In his unbuilt design for Rosa Luxemburg Platz in Berlin, which you see here, Burle Marx blends pools, pavings, and plants, which is what you see on the site plan on the left, which is it's an unbuilt project. But he also designs these flags, flags are typically symbols, they signify things. But if you look at them and all the directions that they point and the pattern surfaces, perhaps we can see them as small acts of defiance, championing diversity and multivalency. Here you see Burle Marx's sitio, which I know Isabela will tell us about. But another remarkable thing, I think, between Bawa and Burle Marx is the way they're able to repurpose parts of or demolished buildings that were being demolished and use them in very contemporary ways and bringing the past into the present. I mentioned that Bawa was born in 1919, and this is also the year in which Albert Einstein becomes a household name. His theory of general relativity predicted a movement of the stars that was then proven in a solar eclipse that year. The idea that time is relative to a body's position in space, that there's no one time, is so foundational. And we have to wonder, how did it affect these three figures when it was a new idea when they were young people? We know that Noguchi had a very deep interest in physics. He was very close to and influenced by Buckminster Fuller. With Burle Marx and Bawa, it's not so clear, and I think this is one of the things we would really like to explore in our project. Physicist Carlo Rovelli writes, "We can think of the world as made up of things, of substances, of entities, of something that is. Or we can think of it as made up of events, of happenings, of processes, of something that occurs, something that does not last, and that undergoes continual transformation, that is not permanent in time. anyone who spent time in a garden knows that it has many times. There's circadian, seasonal, ephemeral temporalities. And if we think about the world as something that is continuously changing and always becoming, is not a garden then a mirror of the world? If we were to seek a totem for Bawa's garden, perhaps it could be the frangipani or the Plumeria obscura tree, which is at the corner of the front lawn. I would say here that the reason I focused on the Sigrier sculpture, the Burle Marx flag, and this tree is that it was actually this combination of objects that began our exploration. We may no longer actually install, the original idea was to install these three works, but as we have been speaking, we have found so many affinities. But I think they are helpful key examples to really enter these three worlds. Bawa crafted this tree like a giant bonsai over time. It is both a sculpture and a tree. It makes space by creating a corner and framing views, but it is also part of an ecosystem, a host of numerous species of lichen, which Dom did an amazing project on, and a perch for the resident bulbuls. Here you see an early photograph of the tree, maybe about 75 years ago. And you see that it started by marking that corner as a spatial, sculptural object. And when we look at the photographs of the garden over time, the frangipani is an evolving constant, indicating time by its size and shape. It is such a vital part of our garden, of the collection. But also being alive, it is fragile, it has a lifespan, and I think it has completely changed the way for our team that we think about collections, how the fight against entropy that we are working on and that we must work on, but these are living things. When Bawa's friend Ray Vijayawardene decided to visit by air and he needed to make a crash landing, he decided to do it on the roof, knowing that Geoffrey would never forgive him if he damaged a tree. I think it's really interesting that he figured out that between a tree and a building, it was the tree that we would protect. And I'll end with this image and a quote by Dutch professor Erik A. de Jong, who writes in the anthology on the necessity of gardens, "The garden is a mirror of the maker and the user in whom it is reflected simultaneously. As an affective space, the garden transcends its own boundaries. As an experiential space, it represents a place in which the world can be known and understood. From the most localized, end quote, from the most localized scale to the cosmic, gardens help us make sense of the world. We often turn to nature or culture for this pursuit, but in a garden, they are combined." Thank you.
So, good afternoon. Thank you for, I would like to thank you, Geoffrey, Bawa's Trust, especially Channa and Shayari, for the opportunity to share about Burle Marx's legacy and the history with you. I'm a landscape architect, as Channa said, and I'm Haruyoshi Ono's daughter, who was the creative partner of Burle Marx for 30 years. When I was born, they are already partners, and I was lucky to know and to grow up with him. I have inherited my father's passion and believed in the relevance of preserving his landscape archives and make them accessible globally. Haruyoshi was the seed of our institute. My country, Brazil, is very rich in natural resources. It's well known for the spectacular landscape and nature with a huge diversity of fauna and flora and culture. From this place, one person has been able to enrich the landscapes of the cities and contributed to the world of the arts, Roberto Burle Marx. Roberto was one of the most important landscape designers of the 20th century. Known for introducing modernist landscape architecture in Brazil, his innovative designs of parks and gardens made him world famous. He was the fourth son of Cecilia Burle, a Brazilian woman, and William Marx, a German Jew. Roberto was not an architect. He went to the School of Fine Art in Rio de Janeiro, but he was visionary and timeless, one of the greatest artists of his time. In the 30s, he started to dialogue with all the intellectual groups and became part of the exponent of Brazilian modernists and was connected with the international scene. At that time, to be a modernist one was to be nationalist, Brazilian, and avant-garde. Marx was a multifaceted artist and incorporated these talents into all his work. He was a painter, a cooker, a printmaker, a jewelry design and fabric design, a musician, a naturalist, and an ecologist. Some of his pieces here. He was also a pioneer in the valorization of Brazilian rainforest. He ignited the discussion about the environmental in the early 60s. He participated and promoted a series of lectures and discussions in Brazil and abroad about those subjects. Since the beginning of his career, he had made several excursions in natural areas in Brazil and abroad, mainly to understand the natural landscape, the relationship between its elements, such as vegetation, stones, topography, and all the things surrounding the water, and mainly to discover new plants with an ornamental potential for use in the new landscapes projects. One of the most important excursions that he did with the group was Amazon, for Amazon in 1983, where the group crossed the whole country. Burle Marx was not just a theorist doing lectures in Brazil and abroad, but really became engaged with the cause. Roberto was one of the first people to call for conservation of Brazilian rainforest and to speak out against deforestation. In these trips, the group researched and discovered several new plants. They sent the discovered material for some important botanical gardens around the world to catalog and to register. And for being discovered of this trip, there are more than 30 plants that honors with his name. Sítio Burle Marx, as Shayari said, it's more or less like here, we are here. He was his living laboratory. So he bought the sítio in 1949, and then the name is Sítio Santo Antônio da Bica at Rio de Janeiro. And in the 70s, he started to live there. As he loved to study and observe plants, he established there the residence and the nursery and the tropical plant collections at Guaratiba. He donated this place to Brazilian government in 1985, now called Sítio Roberto Burle Marx. It has over 3,500 different types of species of plants from different parts of the world and from Brazil also. And there is a part of his private art collection. In 2020, the sítio became World Heritage by UNESCO, so it's a great thing for everybody. The sítio and our institute are partners in the mission to preserve and to disseminate Burle Marx's legacy. Roberto was one of the most important landscape designers from the 20th century. He transported landscape design to the logic of plastic art in an aesthetic perception and believed that garden was the planet organization of natural elements, a sensitive experience. Roberto was one of the first who used native plants in private and public gardens projects. He recognized the diversity of Brazilian flora, its beauty and relevance. At that time, Brazilian garden used to be reproductions of European gardens, and Burle Marx started to change it using native plants from Brazilian biomes, creating a new language of contemporary world landscape design. Roberto has developed many landscape projects in Brazil and around the world. It is important to note that he did not do this alone, but with a team of collaborators who work at Burle Marx Landscape Studio, including my father, Haruyoshi Ono. The landscape studio was created for him in 1955, and Burle Marx and his team have developed more than 2,000 landscape projects, and I will show some icon projects here. Here's in Brazil. And Burle Marx preferred to work on public spaces because, in his words, it provides democratic spaces where the citizens could feel they were part of the city, a place with nature and beauty for all. He was interested in doing projects that could bring joy and art for the people, be part of people's daily life. His public projects carry his ideals and concepts, creating democratic welfare spaces for the citizens. His forward-thinking ideas on relationship between man and nature continues to inspire and influence this important movement today and into the future. This project, Flamengo's Park, was designed in the 60s, and it's one of the most biggest public park with 140 hectares in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, and features some like 170,000 plants of 300 different species. So it's a very huge park. Burle Marx's generosity was to plan a space for the future generation by anticipating the development of the space and the human use. Another project that I brought today is Copacabana Sidewalk at Rio de Janeiro. They had designed this in 1970s, and it is an artistic drawing in the pavement floor for over 5 kilometers of avenue. It's a public art for the people that can walk through every day, that democratic, generous, and alive. Much of his work has a sense of timelessness, perfection, with texture, column, volume, shadows, transforming the space. Another example is Cavanella Estates, a private house designed in the 60s by the architect Oscar Niemeyer, a very well-known architect, Brazilian architect, one of the most important architects in Brazil. The residence is a perfect example of beautiful relationship between architecture, natural landscape, and landscape design. And around the world, he was invited in the 60s to design the garden of a headquarters in UNESCO, and also Noguchi did another garden there that shows the importance of Burle Marx in the international scene. In the 80s, the Burle Marx Landscape Studio was commissioned to design a new area in Miami Beach that calls Biscayne Boulevard in Miami. Burle Marx Landscape Studio was invited to create a new identity for a new area in the city, such as they did in the past in the Copacabana sidewalk. Here's the drawing of the master plan. And the last international project that, with the participation of Burle Marx, was in the beginning of the 90s, when the studio was invited to develop a project for a public park in a new area in the capital of Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur City Center. The complex architecture project was designed by the American architect Cesar Pelli. At the time, these twin towers over there is the biggest tower in the world. For this project, Burle Marx and his partner has traveled many times in Malaysia to understand the local culture, the uses of the public spaces. Now, with 30 years of the park, it is still one of the most important public parks in the capital. It is important to contextualize that due to the importance of the landscape collection of Burle Marx Studio, we recently felt the need to create a non-profit organization that would work proactively with the objective to preserve and reverberate all the Burle Marx legacy. So, in 2019, Burle Marx Institute was created with the aim to maintain and disseminate the entire landscape design collection left by Burle Marx and his collaborator, and make their vast array of work accessible to everyone. Our goal is to connect teams in their work to relevant current topics and effectively open possibility to think new meanings from his legacy, inspire new visions for cities, more greener, healthy, and for all people. Our story begins with Roberto Burle Marx and continues with Haruyoshi, that was a landscape architect and Roberto's creative partner for almost 30 years, as I said. Ono was the driving force in the preservation of this legacy and all its project archive and treasures. Ono was more than a colleague to Burle Marx. He was a close friend, and as Burle Marx put it, it's the son that he never had. It was natural for me to inherit the passion for the profession and of this whole story from my father. In 2017, when my father passed away, we decided to create an institute to continue this mission. The Institute collection is one of the most biggest, I think, Brazilian landscape archive of the 20th century. It presents 7 decades of unique contribution at national and international levels. The Institute archive gathers a diversity of formats, materials and techniques, total more than 150,000 items in different collections, a set of original drawings since the 30s, sketches, photographies, documents, books, historical magazines, newspapers, letters, and works of art. In 2019, with the support of some private donors and American Philanthropy Foundation, we did a diagnosis of the archive to start the process of catalog and the collection. Since 2020, we have a specialized team with museologists and archivists that they are working in the last 3 years in digitize, indexing, information managers in the sense of document and memory preservation, but also to make public access available through a digital internet platform that will be ready next year. Burle Marx Institute is always looking for support and partnership to continue the work of conservation, inventory, and digitization, and more than that, to promote public action and talks, exhibition, publication, and educational material to celebrate Burle Marx's legacy. It's the reason that I'm here today. We have curated in its collection in the light, follow some numbers of our work that we have done so far to make the collection be public and research and new initiatives and with a focus on culture, education, and environment. So there is a lot of work, continued work in process. And Burle Marx has curated its collection in the light of contemporary social issues and demands to inspire the debate on the new alternative for the future. And we believe that such contribution can be revisited from the 5 thematic acts that guide Burle Marx Institute, all linked together, all linked to each other. It's the coexistence between man and nature and the passion for the environmental, the valorization and preservation of Brazilian biomes, the possible urban utopia, thinking on healthy cities, is that how somebody or a group of people can think and draw and imagine cities for the future and then put it in practice, build it, and continues the place where they build it. So it's like a possible utopia that it's done. Collective and collaborative and interdisciplinarity work and how it's important to work together to exchange ideas and knowledge. And freedom, experience and aesthetic enjoyment. So he was an artist, avant-garde, so to have a lot of curiosity, so to test, to feel the space, for him, it's very important. Inspired by finding of its collection and through this thematic access, Burle Marx expects to expand, Burle Marx Institute expects to expand the partnership and to be in connection with initiatives to promote the right of the city and equity that allows new possibility for the future in the collectivity. We did in 2021 our first public exhibition, and it was during the pandemic time, so we have more than 20,000 people visiting, so for us it's very good audience. And we did last year in São Paulo, where we discussed the public and private spaces in another big city in Rio. For this year, we had done some partnership with such a fashion brand to promote our institute, and 2 partnerships with Brazilian embassy, one in Malaysia, helping the publication about the park, and the other one with German embassy to make a small video about the story of Burle Marx and German through the Institute collection. We are now working for a new exhibition next year with the focus on urban possible utopias, presenting the project as an example for city healthier and more inclusive and enlarging the discussion about the environment issues. There is this sentence of Burle Marx that is, for us, is very important. he's never afraid of making mistakes. I leave for you. And I believe that we have the responsibility to build a better world for the next generation. So to plant seeds like Burle Marx and my father did to harvest in the future. So people, today we had a very inspired visit with Channa, and people as us that work with gardens has the passion and commitment with the nature, with the life, with the people. And we have that generosity to plant seeds, to make not for only for us, it's for the others who will come. So I would like to finish with a video, and thank you very much for the audience.
Essa maravilha de flora a gente não vê nos jardins brasileiros. Devido à grande devastação que o Brasil passa, muita coisa vai desaparecer. Daí eu ter despertado em mim esse desejo de perpetuar e de utilizar nos jardins. Procurei compreender o jardim aplicado à nossa natureza humana e, sobretudo, às necessidades brasileiras, porque eu não quero fazer apenas jardim para uma casa de milionários. Eu gostaria de fazer jardins em que o povo pudesse participar.
Tinha muita curiosidade pelas coisas. Usava as plantas como uma palheta de cores numa pintura, numa composição.
Toda obra que nós fazemos deve servir em benefício de outros, e sobretudo dos brasileiros que virão depois de nós, que também têm direito de ter uma vida mais equilibrada.
Isabela, thank you very much for introducing us to the wonderful work of Roberto Burle Marx. And of course, we all know at some point Geoffrey Bawa was up in Sao Paulo, and that's really as close as we got to some of that work. I think some of his work is in Sao Paulo as well. And of course, we know that the work of Burle Marx made a huge contribution to the urban life of the cities of South America, and of course to others later on. I just want to sort of ask a few, take this conversation a little further. While both of our institutions, Shayari, yours, and the Institute Burle Marx, have documents and drawings and photographs and things like that as an archive, one of the things that I contemplate about is what happens to that archive that's kind of in the head of the people who worked with people like Roberto Burle Marx. Because gardens are amazing things, which, as you said, I mean, they're continuously growing, they're falling apart, they're growing again. And while the archive and the document and the record, they record, it's the process that is an important part of having a garden. So are there ways in which the two institutions, I mean, I know a bit about our side, but Isabela, are there processes by which the incredible knowledge that was a part of your father's experience, how that was recorded and perhaps passed on, particularly in the maintenance of these gardens of the future? Do you have any thoughts about that?
As you say, a garden is a work in progress. And I discovered that even in archive, it's a work in progress, because first you have like a technical drawing, but then we started to open the other files, and then we discovered there is a huge lot of sketches and all the process, and we started to dive in the archive, and then started to give new meanings for this archive, to think how they did that in the past and how it can be important today. So it's the same as the garden. It's a work in progress to discover the ideas, the concepts of each project. And about the memories and how my father passed the concept that he learned with Burle Marx, it was funny because he worked with him for 30 years, and then I never worked with Burle Marx, but I worked with my father for 25 years, me and my partner. So, and I remember when we are just driving for a new garden, and he said, "Oh, look at this garden! Look at this tree!" And how they work together in the nature, how they work together, and the flower and the seed. So it's all the perception that Burle Marx taught for him sometimes. So, and even in the airplane, he say, "Oh, look down, and there is the shape of the river. How can be inspired?" And sometimes Burle Marx asked take pictures for him to remember the shapes. So I think it's more or less natural to pass for us some ideas and some concepts that Burle Marx passed for him.
So did your father record some of these things? I mean, does he have his own photographs that he might have had that conversation with Burle Marx?
Sure, he did. He was a photographer also. So he did like 30 years of record, the whole work of Burle Marx with him, and the travels and the parties and all the events. So everything was done, like it's more than 70,000 chroma film. It's a lot of material.
That is a lot of material.
All the trips, so all it's registered. And of course, along his life and Burle Marx's life, there's a lot of interviews for television, and so we have this also.
Thank you. And Shayari, you are talking about, I mean, again, I know I'm supposedly the chair of the trust, but as you know well, that we let you do your work. So I'd like to question a little bit about how is it that you're going to begin to make these connections between three practices were reasonably different. Here's Bawa, the gardener who sort of designed buildings as a garden, as it were. Again, Angelendran's thought and what you elaborated on earlier. And there's Burle Marx, who had a passion for plants, which was quite different to the passion that Geoffrey had. Geoffrey didn't know a single plant to save his life. But here's Burle Marx, he's got 30 plants named after him, which he discovered. So that's quite different. And of course, Noguchi worked with a completely different set of materials. So what's the core of that connection?
Thank you, Channa. I think that in some ways it connects a little bit to the previous question, which is, we've started oral histories to record the narratives of people like Channa, who saw how Geoffrey kept maintained and crafted the garden. We're also in this program we have an amazing team of 35 gardeners who keep this space every day, and we are trying to record their histories too. But I think that this project, in a way, came from this sense that no matter how many oral histories we do and how many drawings and photographs and manuals we do, which we will do, I think, as part of the project, there's no one person or one document that can capture it, because it's so much about how each of us engage with this garden. I'm sure if each of you were to make a response, it would be different. And that was why I think one was we just thought it would be good to talk to other institutions, and in the conversations with you, Isabela, and also with the folks at the Noguchi Museum, it has been amazing to realize that we are actually dealing with many of the same questions. But then I think that it also, every time we were trying to tie these parts together, we were scaling back and back and back and back. And that's when suddenly this quote by Noguchi, that actually this is a place where we contemplate the relative of things in space, the relative of things in time. and actually of life, that the garden is actually a lens for us to do these things. So I know that's a very open answer. I think the answer is that we won't have one thing, but we will try and have different ways in which we can record.
I guess
different.
it's a work in progress, as it were.
Exactly.
And we'll
It
see
will always
something,
be.
well, we'll see something, some direction, I guess, in 18 months' time. I just want to throw the house open. Is there anything? I know Burle Marx, I mean, maybe a new experience for some of you who are here. You may have seen his work, but you may or may not have noticed it. But I just want to ask you if there's anything that you'd like to ask Isabela or Shayari about the project, perhaps even more about Burle Marx's gardens, because she's come all the way from there and has a direct experience of them. And if anyone has anything to ask.
Burle Marx's private garden, personal garden, used like Lunuganga is used now as
How was Burle Marx's private garden, or was it used like Lunuganga is used now?
His private garden is the place that I showed for you, the Sítio Burle Marx. It's like a laboratory. It's not really, he never designed the garden, but he brought a lot of plants from abroad and then plant together. And of course, if you're gonna visit there, it's a real garden and a very alive garden, beautiful. But it's all the time he was changing during his life, so it's a very special place. And of course, there is the whole collection of plants. So a lot of greenhouses there in a separate space. So it's a place for research, botanical research, and there is all. It's interesting that I visit a lot of places of Bawa here, and it's have private collections such as glasses and artwork, and it makes us understand how the artists think, what they like. So it's similar with Burle Marx. There is a lot of art collection and books, and so it's very interesting to visit. It's very magic space.
Were the practice of indigenous communities, were they taken into account when Burle Marx worked?
He was very concerned about the popular culture in Brazil. So when he traveled for this trip around Brazil to see plants, he was in contact with the very unique culture from the spaces, and then it inspired him. But it's not really it's more unconscious, but it inspired in the process of the project.
A sort of open-ended question about color in relation to both Burle Marx and Bawa, and how Bawa's gardens are green gardens, and Burle Marx uses color in a very strong and focused kind of way. And I'm wondering whether there is any sort of thought that's gone into the ways that each of them have chosen to use color. So in a way, it's a question for all three of you.
Can I start it? I have one thing. When I saw the Clara's movie last 2 nights ago, I was wondering why it's in black and white when she shows the gardens. And the thing that she said, that is because he was worried about the shadow and the texture more than the color. And for me, as a landscape architect from Brazil, color is very important, as important as texture, volume, perspective, and everything. So, and for Burle Marx, because we carry on the DNA of Burle Marx way of design landscape project, and for us, it's very important to work together with the volume, texture, plants, and all the natural elements such as water and stones and topography, but the color is very important. So I was just, oh my God, I need to see the green in the movie. And I understood that, of course, for Bawa, it's important, the volume and the experience. And for Burle Marx also, this experience in the garden that we had today with your visit, it's very important to feel the garden, to have the sense of, to hear the birds and to taste, to put the food in the grass. And it's an experience, but of course Burle Marx used a lot of shapes and color, which is very powerful.
I think with the issue of color and Burle Marx, I think if you think about um, uh, the plants that we know of and look at, much of the plants that you see even here in Sri Lanka that are sort of bright colors that Burle Marx uses in his gardens in Brazil actually come from South America. If you really look at the natural vegetation of a place like Sri Lanka and much of South Asia, even Kerala, you don't have the intensity of colors of leaves and things like that that you find in Brazil. Much like the macaws and the toucans and all these extraordinary animals with so much color and such large size that they're present in the landscape, I think. And whereas in Sri Lanka, it's really much more a monochromatic landscape. You occasionally have flowers on the top of trees that bloom, but you don't have color in the same way that Burle Marx had access to, like the bright red cordyliums and you know, all of those wonderful crab's claws and, you know, all of that heliconias, all of which actually come from South America. So I think it was part of Burle Marx's DNA to use that color and perhaps have some kind of relationship to his landscapes, whereas
Perhaps I'm thinking that now, he was graduated in fine arts, so he was an artist.
And he was an
used
artist,
colors.
yes.
And Bawa was architect, so I'm architect, I know we are very rational to draw in very technical ways, so perhaps this is influence in the use of color.
But I think that's exactly, I think there's really something there that Burle Marx comes to making gardens from fine arts. Bawa comes to making gardens from literature and law. And Noguchi he trains as a medical student before he becomes an architect. There is really something where within their discipline, they're also outside of their discipline. And I think that is, again, one of these affinities. I also think in terms of color, yes, there is a whole, I think if we get very technical about like chroma and hue, I mean, I would argue there's as much color in this, it's just a different kind of range. It's not a range of hue.
Here more it's sort of the range of texture that Geoffrey uses, I think.
Yeah, and chroma for Brazil. I don't know how you feel about that, Michael, as an answer.
And I like the idea of the three people that we are engaging with in this program actually come from different fields before they sort of come into to try and engage with space. A medical person, a lawyer, and an artist. So I think we are probably going to see something very interesting in your conversations with the others as well.
Yeah, I think it's why this has gone from an installation project into a conversation project, because there are these affinities. I mean, we don't want to be very literal about them, but I think they just open up all these ways of us to approach the way we look at a garden, the way we look at their practice. And we'll see where we get in 18 months.
Philip.
How is the legacy of Burle Marx and the other landscape architects been on the planners in Brazil today? And what effect is that having on preserving the Amazon?
About the cities now, because of the growth of the population, the people there in Brazil, they are very inspired by Burle Marx's work. And of course, there is a lot of, it was 2,000 projects designed, but there is some that was not built. So for example, in the exhibition in São Paulo, there is a lot of public spaces that were not built. And the idea is to now build it because the city needs this public spaces. So I think first, if we show all the material that we have, started to open for discussion of have more democratic, more public spaces for the cities, especially in Brazil, because we have a growing population and not too poor population, so they need public spaces. I think it's the start to redo new project and put it in practice the old projects for there.
And I think he also asked, is that also having an effect on the way people view the Amazon and its, I mean, by looking at his gardens, does it inspire people to hopefully protect it? Or am I right, Philip?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, for us, Amazon is a very specific theme to discuss because it's a very important area for us and it's not protected, as you know. And of course, to think in being contact, even because of the pandemic time, people started to valorize the contact with nature. So, and with his legacy, because he went there in 1983, and then for like 40 years ago, it's already destroyed, devastated. So it's one way that we put light there and to try to preserve all this area. And even not Amazon, but we have a lot of different kind of natural biome that is under this devastation. So we are just trying to put these thoughts to open discussion for the preservation.
Hello. This is related a bit to the previous question. We were talking about the legacy of people like Burle Marx and Bawa. And I think from the talks also, we were talking about decolonization, nationalism. I think obviously one of the problems they were trying to solve is the tropical world at that point didn't have a garden style. There was an Italian garden, there are British gardens, there's a Mughal garden. But what does a tropical garden look like in a formal way? And that was clearly something that Bawa was trying to sort of deliberately get his head around, I think, probably Burle Marx as well. The question is, what is the legacy of this? Have we gone further, not in the architecture space, have we gone further along developing a coherent tropical garden style? It was quite interesting to see that Burle Marx was involved in the Kale project. So there is some crossover between Brazilian landscape and, because the tropical world is the tropical world. There are differences, but also a similarity. So are we, it's not a field I know much about, who is currently working on this space? Where do we see interesting things happening in the world of tropical gardens? Yeah, it's just something that seems interesting.
I think that there is a history of gardens, very ancient history. I mean, if you think of Sigiriya, all the monasteries, they all had very important herbal gardens. They were not, I mean, this is where we are. It's so interesting because you have the lawn, which is definitely an introduced idea, and then the borelu, which is a traditional way of gardens made of stone. I'm not going to answer your question, Sawan, on who today, because I think there are many, many garden makers. But I think maybe part of the project is really looking at the way we can continue to draw from these legacies, and these gardens are still very present in the fabric of. We're still learning so much about them also. I mean, speaking for Lunuganga, I think while we didn't, I mean, Isabela doesn't really know, wasn't a botanist or a botanical person. And yet, when we are working with the University of Jawaharlal of Peradeniya to do a biodiversity study, they are astounded by the variety of endemic species that have been so carefully placed here. I mean, that cannot be by accident. So I think part of this project is also really to revive some of that knowledge around trees that is actually very much part of our history. My colleague Anisha is doing a project called Tree Talks, where we'll be recording some of the histories. Today's ecological tour was maybe one of those steps. But I think maybe that there is a lot still going on, but this is all us beginning to switch on to that more.
I guess, sorry, just to follow up, but it's exactly that. Why in the intervening 70 years are there no other Lunugangas? Why there have been hotels and so on have tried this, but why have we not seen more of these emerge? That's kind of the question. Why have more, or are more emerging, perhaps we don't know about it, etc.
Well, I could take that up. I think there have been sort of hidden places. I mean, Lunuganga, for instance, for much of the 75 years of its existence was a hidden secret. I mean, no one was allowed to come in here. So I won't be surprised that somewhere in some hidden corners of Sri Lanka there are gardens that follow what I think, what Shayari was pointing out was a South Asian tradition of trees, of rocks, of walls, of lines in the landscape. which is very much the long tradition of the Sri Lankan garden, going all the way to Sigiriya, the Royal Goldfish Park in Anuradhapura, and so on, where it's a kind of interesting combination of human intervention in a natural landscape. And you see that a lot if you go to the old temple. So I'm sure somewhere that tradition goes on. In the rest of the tropics, interestingly, is probably the biggest influence is probably Burle Marx, because the painterly quality, a lot of tropical gardens that you see in places like a lot of the tropical parks and so on, seem to pick up from the Burle Marx idea of the painterly garden, the garden that has color, that sort of engages with color in a very specific way, in a painterly kind of way. You can begin to see perhaps a little bit of a mix of gardens of the South Asian tradition, that I'm just calling it the South Asian tradition of rocks and stones and all of that. In places like Bali, there are a few gardens that kind of have allusions to a tropical garden, but they also have their own garden tradition going back to the 15th, 16th centuries, which inspired Geoffrey Bawa himself to, in some of the work he did in Bali. What's it called? Tirthaganga, one of them, which is a series of beautiful ponds and fountains and so on, built in the 15th, 16th centuries in Bali. A little bit of European influence, but you can begin to see how it's tried to make a combination between tropical planting and that. But one hopes that somewhere hidden in a corner of Sri Lanka is a garden like Lunuganga or two, which we might like to look at.
And you can visit some of them tomorrow if you join our open house program.
Yes, tomorrow morning's open house program will take us to a couple of them, and perhaps that might be well worth doing.
Today, when we visited Ina de Silva's house, I was wondering that if one has not experienced the house during the monsoon, one hasn't understood it. And so my question is, the weather, the rains, which Geoffrey has really reflected in his architecture, is that also reflected in Burle Marx architecture? Does the phenomenon of monsoon, of rains, play a role there? Because, I mean, today we're sitting here, no rain, no nothing, but I was here for the first time in my life, some 32 years ago, and the sky was coming down. It was a total different experience. And when I was in Ina Silva's house many times with Saskia and Pierre, also during the monsoon, it was a total different experience. So what does the rains, the monsoon, the water, the weather phenomenon, what kind of role does it play with Geoffrey and maybe also with Burle Marx?
In Burle Marx, we don't have in Brazil the monsoon. We have rain, but not too much as you have here. So of course, rain and all the nature things are influencing the garden. So you have an experience if it's a sunny day, and if you have another experience, and even the both are very powerful when it's a raining day. So, but it's not strong as it is here. So.
And interestingly, with the Ina courtyard, Geoffrey originally, and the 1963 photographs he took, originally had just the frangipani tree and grass. The reason for the garden we have today is actually Ina. She had a couple of dogs, and she said, my gosh, they used to go and sort of mess up the place, and it was all horrible to have a lawn in the middle of your house with your dogs running about on it. And she designed that garden. So the actual garden that you see, the pebble garden that you see in the center of the Ina house was actually Ina's garden. And then she planted the couple of other trees that, I mean, we've tried to keep them as close to her garden as possible. I'm still battling with Amila for 2 more trees that she has to put in there. But she planted 4 other small plants and did that wonderful pattern of river stone. Because the lawn didn't work. So in a way, she connected back to the old tradition of the rock and stone and like the Borolukot garden of the Sri Lankan tradition, doing away with the lawn tradition that had been introduced into her courtyard. So which is very appropriate because, as you say, when the rain comes down, how horrible it would be to have sort of grass getting inundated by it, instead of which it now completely disappears into the stone and the rock. And so that's, I think, something that is worth looking at. So thank you very much. I think it's kind of also time for a gin and tonic or something. But thank you very much for being with us on this very, very special occasion on the 20th anniversary memorial lecture, and also the 75th anniversary of this garden. It's wonderful to see all of you with us, because it gives us inspiration and hope for the future. And as someone told me, these are the things that we need to do in times of trouble to keep hope going. And it's these projects like this and the support that we get from all of you that gives us hope for the future. We hope these discussions will go on in the programs that the team at the Geoffrey Bawa Trust has put together, in the conversations that will happen in the next season, possibly an installation from Firi, I think. And then eventually with definitely an installation from Sumaya, which we are all looking forward to in the next Yala season. So the 3 seasons, the Maha, the Yala, and the Maha, are the 3 crop seasons of Sri Lanka. The Yala is the southwest monsoon, the Maha being the northeast, and of course the next will be the following Yala, which is the southwest monsoon of 2024. So we hope you keep coming, joining us in all our programs, because I think it'll all be a sort of collective learning experience for all of us. And like the 3 protagonists, the main protagonists in this project, Burle Marx, Isabela, and Geoffrey Bawa, we are all people who are not architects. A lot of you are not people who are architects or landscape designers, but perhaps you will have your own perspectives, which can add to a better and greater understanding of the landscapes and the architecture of this cross-section of the world. So once again, thank you very much, and keep supporting us.